Hi guys. Okay, just a short video today. So we're starting our week, our final week of proper epistemology content. This time we're turning to something different from previous weeks. So this time I'm not. Our theme this week, our main topic, is not a big picture answer to this thing I've been calling the problem of uncertainty. Instead, we're taking a slightly different direction entirely from the sorts of answers we've been looking at. So that is to say, instead of looking at these sort of individualistic conceptions of that problem, the problem of how to form your beliefs when you're uncertain, we're going to look at social dimensions of this kind of thing. So the way we set up our social structures has an epistemic dimension, right? The way that we form our beliefs often involves the way we rely on others as sources of information in lots of kinds of ways. So most simply, or maybe most directly, there is a standard sort of philosophical question about what the status of testimony is as a potential source of knowledge or justification. So for that kind of question, this question of when it's okay to rely on others, whether testimony is something we should think of as like just another kind of observational evidence, or whether testimony is a source of an irreducible source of justification, right? For that kind of stuff, you can take a look at the first recommended reading for this week, the chapter 6 of the Nagel book, which will give you some pointers to some classical sources, other further reading you can do on that kind of question. If that is something that interests you, you can also get in touch with me. I will recommend things for you to look at. But your required reading for this week is on a cluster of more specialized and I think more current topics and a little less abstract. So you've got 2 required readings for this week. The reason why my video today is going to be pretty short is I think both of these are pretty clear. I think you will not struggle to have opinions about them. So I would like you to try and read both of these, at least read through them once before the tutorials or the drop-in sessions this week, and we can talk about what you think. So you've got a paper by Regina Rini on fake news and partisan epistemology, and you have an article by Nguyen on echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. Okay, as I said, I don't want to give you a guide in advance to these things because I think you're going to find them relatively straightforward to read. But if you tell me you're struggling with it, let me know and I'll record a video after you've had a chance to give it a try. But let me just click over to take a look at those papers themselves and just give you some things to look for when you're reading. So first of all, both papers you'll notice have 2 things in their titles. They're both A and B type titles. So one thing you're going to want to look for is how do these 2 authors, Rini and Nguyen, how do they define the 2 terms in their titles? What is fake news according to Rini? And as you're looking at, think about evaluating those definitions, right? So you might think, for example, Rini's definition of fake news doesn't capture some examples of what you would want to call fake news. Maybe you'll think her definition counts too many things as fake news, right? Some things that she counts as fake news, you would not count as fake news. So that's one way to evaluate these sorts of definitions. But another way, which I'm going to suggest is maybe more important, is to look at the use to which she puts that definition. The use she puts that definition to. I think that made sense. So she's going to define fake news in a certain way because she's going to use that definition in order to make certain kinds of claims and certain kinds of arguments about what fake news is, why it's bad, how to avoid it, that sort of thing. And likewise for in Nguyen's article, echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. Okay, so here are some things I want you to focus on. So Rini is going to tell you, here's an analysis of the concept of fake news. Okay, we've looked at analysis in this sense before, right? Something like the justified true belief account of knowledge is supposed to be an analysis of knowledge. That is, it's a non-circular theory of knowledge that is there's a sense in which you're breaking down the concept of knowledge into parts that don't themselves require you to appeal to the concept of knowledge. So it's it's reductive in that sense, in the sense that it's non-circular. It's an analysis also in the sense that it's breaking this single thing down into parts that add up to it. Okay, so you're going to be looking at an analysis in that kind of sense. Okay, Rini is also going to identify distinctive epistemic features of social media testimony. I imagine most of you have encountered a bunch of social media testimony. You might think about how her description applies to the kind of social media testimony that you have encountered. She's going to argue, so in past years I've found this is one of the more controversial things among students I've had at this university. She's going to argue that partisanship in testimony reception is not always epistemically vicious. In fact, some forms of partisanship are consistent with individual epistemic virtue. Let's unpack that for a second. Partisanship in testimony reception. So something like preferring to receive or receiving more generously testimony from people who are aligned with your partisan views. Okay, she's going to argue that that's not always epistemically vicious, so that's not always a bad thing. And in fact, some forms of this kind of partisanship are consistent with individual epistemic virtue. She's not saying that they are virtuous, but you can be virtuous and do that kind of thing. Notice she's talking about individual epistemic virtue. So a theme of both Rini's and Nguyen's papers is going to be some things that look epistemically bad at a social level might result from people acting just fine if we evaluate them just as individuals. So you might find yourself in a social structure where if you follow, let's say, the rules that apply to individual knowers, individual inquirers, you might still wind up in a bad epistemic situation. You might wind up reinforcing, in fact, a socially, epistemically bad and vicious kind of thing. Okay, so she's going to say some kinds of partisanship and testimony reception are, if we just look at the individual level, fine. Okay, and then she's going to argue for a solution to the problem of fake news and saying that it's going to require changes to institutions such as social media platforms, not just to individual epistemic practices. You might think that this follows naturally from the claim in 3, right? So if we're saying some forms of partisanship are consistent with individual epistemic virtue, then fixing our individual epistemic practices isn't going to get rid of partisanship in testimony reception. So we need to do something else. Okay. Make sure that you watch out for what the connection is between these two things, right? I started out saying, or the abstract here starts out saying, we're going to analyze fake news. And then we talk about social media testimony. And then we start talking about partisanship and testimony reception. So make sure that you're sensitive to how it is on Rini's picture that fake news relates to partisanship in testimony reception. Okay, those are things I want you to watch out for. I also want you to watch out, as you're reading these two papers, for whether the things that Rini says fit with or contrast with, contradict the things that Nguyen says. So Nguyen in this paper is not talking about fake news, at least not specifically, but he is talking about certain kinds of social epistemic structures. So one of the central things he's going to do is make a distinction. He's going to say, look, here's an introductory thing. Discussion of the phenomena of post-truth and fake news often implicates the closed epistemic networks of social media. We're talking about social media again. Recent conversation has, however, blurred two distinct social epistemic phenomena. People have not been making this distinction, so I'm going to make it. I'm going to define epistemic bubbles on the one hand, echo chambers on the other hand. They are different, and importantly different. Okay, and then he's going to go and apply that distinction to suggest there are different ways that are appropriate to address these kinds of things. Okay, so it's crucial to keep these phenomena distinct. Implicit question, why? First, answer to the why question, echo chambers can explain the post-truth phenomena in a way that epistemic bubbles cannot. So if we can't see the difference between echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, he's going to say, you're not going to be able to explain the things that our first sentence wanted to explain. Okay. You might ask yourself, is there a difference between post-truth phenomena and fake news? You might ask yourself, to the extent Nguyen is talking about fake news, is he conceiving of it the same way that Rini is? Let's see what you think. Okay, second answer to the why is it important to keep these things distinct question. Each type of structure requires a distinct intervention. So fixing these things requires different kinds of interventions. Mere exposure to evidence can shatter an epistemic bubble, but may actually reinforce an echo chamber. You're going to want to see him argue for that. Finally, a third answer to the why question. Echo chambers are much harder to escape. Once in their grip, an agent may act with epistemic virtue, but social context will pervert those actions. Escape from an echo chamber may require a radical rebooting of one's belief system. So, again, just like Rini was saying, you might have social epistemic structures that make it so that people acting with individual epistemic virtue wind up with bad outcomes. Nguyen is also saying, once you're in an echo chamber, that's an echo chamber, not an epistemic bubble, an agent may act with epistemic virtue, but social context will pervert your action. So even though if we just consider you individually, you're doing everything fine, because of the structure you're in, those virtuous things that you're doing will actually make things bad for you. So notice, Rini said the way to fix the problem of fake news is to make changes to institutions. Nguyen's thinking about, I don't want to say an individualistic, but not such an institutional remedy. What does escape from an echo chamber require? It may require a radical rebooting of your belief system. So this is thinking about what an individual needs to do to get out of this kind of structure, as opposed to what we need to do in order to prevent the structures from occurring at all. Right. I think that's the question Rini's answer. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. You should read these things. You should form opinions. We should talk about it. If you find places that you get stuck in these articles, let me know. I'll help. I think you're going to get it, though. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.